podcast from Drew and Mike is, I think it's really cool, and that is what I wanted to say.
Two and a mic. Two, 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 two and a mic. Two, 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 two and a mic. John Adams did a lot that was good. He was a founding father. He was extremely intelligent. He fought for democracy and the ideals of liberty. He was a man who valued human life, and he did not himself own a slave at a time when owning slaves was legal. Then he became VP and, even worse, he became president. Number 2, following hot on the heels of George Washington. In my talk with Aidan, assessing the performance of Mr. Adams, we get into the nitty-gritty of this chaotic period in US history and, at the end, surmise how Adams rates, not as a person, but as a president. Thanks again to Aidan, who provides insight and passion in abundance and no shortage of entertainment in his delivery. Enjoy. Hi, Aidan. It's great to have you back. How are you?
I'm doing great, Zach. How are you?
Yeah, good. I've told you already privately, but I should once again repeat as well. You know, I'm getting lots of really cool compliments about you. I think people just relate to the way that you communicate. You are very liberal with your use of colorful terminology, and people like that passion. And
That makes me excited.
yeah,
Yeah.
so it's brilliant to hear, and I just enjoy talking with you. But
Yeah.
they also appreciate you. So thank you for being you, basically, Aidan.
Well, yeah, thanks for having me and thanks for letting me not really worry about censoring myself too much. I don't really
Yes, no.
yeah, I don't really feel like I'm ever having to like not be myself when I'm like chatting with you. And that always feels nice, so I appreciate that.
Good. Long may that continue. I can guarantee that there will be no censorship from my side. So feel free, man. You know, freedom
That
of
makes
speech
me
and all that.
excited.
Hey, yeah, bring it in. So, okay, so today we're going to be talking about number 2,
Yeah.
Mr. John Adams. So, the senior member of the Adams family, if you
Yeah.
pardon that particular reference point. Um, yeah, yeah, I don't know. Where's the hand? So, yeah, I mean, where would we start with that, Aidan?
Uh, I mean, with him being born in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1735, that's probably where I'd
That's
start it. Pretty early on, he like became a lawyer, graduating from Harvard and getting into his profession and immediately found like patriotism. Like he immediately was like, I like the Stamp Act thing. Fuck that. I do not appreciate that being around. And he was super verbal about it. And like that really him verbalizing a lot of this stuff really ended up getting eyes on him just because he really knew what he was talking about. You know, his political savvy was something that I wrote down was just phenomenal. Like he did know what he was talking about. He knew how to be a good diplomat. He knew how to like communicate between people. He knew how to address like the problems that he saw. And it felt as though he usually did a pretty decent job. At least in his early career. Like you'll see later on that he definitely goes very back and forth. Was something that I heard and read a lot was that he just like his personality was not built for the presidency because he was super soft spoken. He was really insecure about a lot of his decisions. He had a lisp. He just like there were a lot of he was never really the person that people were like you should lead. It was usually just like a all right, you're stepping into this position, okay, kind of thing. And so like he joins the first and second Continental Congress, and appoints George Washington as the commander of the Continental Army, and travels across seas and becomes like a diplomat for between Britain and France. And it like he's in France and working with between France and Holland and Britain to try to negotiate like peace agreements between everyone, because at this point everything is kind of fucked over there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you really sort of wrap things up there, more or less. This, yeah, we can stop now. Okay, end of. No,
Yep,
no.
that's it.
But no, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely spot on as well. So I chose a slightly different approach to doing the research on John Adams, and I just kind of went into documentation and articles and sort of essays and stuff like that, rather than
Yeah,
pouring through documentaries.
yeah,
And something that really does come up is exactly as you say. The guy was extremely intelligent. He could really organize his thoughts into a very coherent and convincing argument. And I think that's basically what sort of set him up for the career that he was to have
yeah,
thereafter. Allowed himself to simply be satisfied up until he became VP to George Washington. I think you
yeah,
could have said, damn, this guy was, I think he probably would have had a far greater legacy than later on becoming VP twice and then president as well, because I
yeah,
think those I think those 12 years kind of knocked, who he was. Um,
yeah,
mainly for what you said, that he kind of flowed this way and that way, and I think he lost his path, as it were,
yeah.
considerably.
Like you kind of see it the further on that he goes, that the more that like he's kind of going back and forth with his decisions. And like, I mean, early on, I mean, he is doing, like, I completely agree that if he would have not become president, his legacy would have been very, very different. Like, because he became president and the things that happened during his presidency, his legacy is completely shot from that point. Like we look at his legacy as a president, and he did not do a lot of things that were like known for being great. Like, we'll get into that stuff later, but it's a lot of just like his decisions going back and forth. He's not being like he's just not being consistent as an individual, like, and that's something that you need from a president, is somebody who is consistent. You need somebody who's reliable. He was noted as like just being all over the place. Like he'd wake up one day and he'd be like in a great mood, feeling like he was on top of the world, and then the next day he'd wake up and he was like feeling like he had nothing. And it's like you go back and forth in those ways, and it's just really tough. Like, and you're leading this country that like that has just become a country, like that's a tough place to be. um
Yeah, and also, I mean, that kind of brings into question whether or not he suffered from imposter syndrome or some other kind of psychological pressures, as it were, that he
yeah,
kind of placed upon himself. And let's face it, he's president number two. There is no psychological or backup team support where you've got people who sit there and say, hey, Mr. President, you need to take a rest, you need to do this, you need
yeah,
to do that. You don't have that team back then.
yeah,
Yeah, and so therefore, to be able to reflect upon that as we can now, as it were,
yeah,
he didn't have access to those things, which could have made a difference.
yeah. The whole time that I was like reading these like little bits about his personality, the whole time I was just like, I feel like if this was our time period, we would be able to diagnose these things, like we'd be able to figure out what's wrong with him just through simple diagnoses. And like that might not mean that he's suitable for president, like, and that's totally possible. Um, so the whole time I was just thinking about like the modern day, the things that we have now and how we can like look at them. And it really does change it, like looking at that point of view. It's like, Oh, that's probably like maybe he was bipolar. Like maybe he had this like back and forth thing like going on, and that could explain like those feelings, you know, like the imposter syndrome, 100%. Like I could understand that. I mean, considering the stuff that he did, and then getting into this position and just kind of like, especially after being VP, where he felt like he had no power, he did nothing whatsoever. Like getting into the position of being president and then having all of the power, it's like, whoa, okay, hold up. Like this is probably a big change for him, you know? Um,
Mm.
yeah.
And you could say, with based upon some of the kind of positions that he held, that may have got to his head a little bit. But
Yeah.
again, as you say, we'll come back to that later. But I mean, he's not the first leader, is he, to have had some kinds of issues, whether they are psychological or physical ailments. We talked about George Washington before, that he was, constantly sort of badgered, as it were, with physical problems, and
Mhm.
it's not an easy job to have, is it?
No, and I think that once you get like all the problems that you had beforehand are only exacerbated because you become president. You know, like it's everything tenfold. Like the pressure's on, and when the pressure's on, your body feels that too. Like, and you are going to have physical side effects because of it. And so I could totally understand and see if like he's already having some smaller problems in his life, but then like you get into the presidency and you have all this stress and you have all this pressure on you, and it just adds on to it so much that you're just like your body is physically breaking down, you know? Like with George Washington, homie was dying in office. Like he had a couple of heart attacks and he was just like, and then he was like, all right, guys, I think I'm done. Like, and then he died. And it was like tight, you know? Like, and I think that that's another thing that's really interesting with Adams is him being part of the Federalist Party. Like, and him being president while he's kind of watching the Federalist Party die. You know, like George Washington dies, Alexander Hamilton gets fucking dueled and dies as well from Vice President Aaron Burr, and like this is post his presidency at this point, but he is watching it happen, and he like at the very end of his presidency, he makes like the big move to like stack the courts, and he does. Like and it's one of these things where it's like you see it in the same situation from the past, but like you look at it nowadays, and we've also had presidents who have stacked the court, and it's not really a huge like it feels like a huge deal, but in some ways it's really not, you know, like, and it was just because he was worried about losing the Federalist Party in the way that he did, like that party did die out, and it did become like the Whigs and another party that I can't remember the name of. Um, but they were like both under like Abraham Lincoln's parties at one point. Like Abraham Lincoln supported those parties. Um, and it's just a really interesting thing to see how those coincide and watching them happen and watching how he is responding to it all happen. You know, I think his presidency really does just show like at least like at the very end, it really showed fear to me, like fear of losing everything that he had like worked for, you know?
Yeah, and this is another issue we're going to come back to as well, because this element of the dignity of the office,
Yeah.
I think it's somehow presidents who then have that office forget the fact that it's the office and not the individual. I feel, and that's a very easy sort of trap to fall into. From what I read, Adams, when he left the White House, he kind of tiptoed out in the middle of the night because shit, I don't want
Yeah.
to leave this place. So, I mean,
Yeah.
we can all relate to this kind of story, as it were. But I mean, let's not forget, there's another guy more recently who did everything he could to stay in the White House, and that didn't work very
Yeah.
well either. Um, but yeah,
And
okay,
it's
yeah.
so fun to draw those parallels, you know, like to be like, oh wait, Donald Trump also like stacked the courts. Like we're getting ahead of ourselves, but like when Barack Obama left his office, he left a bunch of seats open in America's courts, and it was an unbelievable amount of seats. And as soon as Donald Trump came into office, he filled pretty much every single one of those seats with Republican judges, and that drastically changes things. Like And you see the same thing here, and it's fun to draw those parallels of like, here's another president way more recently who also tiptoed out of the White House. Like he stole things from the White House. Like, and here's number two doing the exact same sort of shit, you know? Like it's so fun. I love it.
Yeah, and it's also great as you say, the parallels between Trump and Adams. Earlier in Trump's life, he was critical of anybody who claimed the fifth, because
Yeah.
he said if you claim the fifth, you're guilty. And then obviously we all saw how later on, oh no, I'd take the fifth on that one.
Take the
Um,
fifth. Plead
yeah,
the fifth.
yeah, and exactly, and in similar case here with Adams, with regards to the courts. He very much argued for the independence of the courts, and at an earlier stage, and then afterwards, as you said, stacking them himself. So therefore, committing the very same crime for which part of his reputation had been built upon before. But anyway,
Yeah.
we're jumping around, and it's because we're
Yeah.
probably excited to get into some of these things. All right, let's go back to the Stamp Act of
Yeah.
1765. So, the Stamp Act was a sort of payment of direct tax by the colonies for stamped documents. As to why
Yep.
they would give a shit, I don't know exactly. But anyway, so for this privilege of having officially stamped documents, they would have to pay a direct tax. I guess it's what we all pay stamps for nowadays.
Yep.
And the intention of this from the Brits was that it would pay for their war with France. So,
Yep.
okay. Adams didn't like this.
Adams had some stuff to say.
He
He was
did.
Yeah, I love what he says about it. He's like, I mean, he pretty much just dismantles it like from the base and like takes it from the British like rule of law, which is like no taxation without consent, which is like one of the first things that he brings up. He's like, you cannot do this. Like this, we are not consenting to this. And also the jury to like a jury of peers. And there's nobody in the British rule of parliament at that point that is representing the colonies. And so the whole time he's just like, what the fuck are you guys doing? That like you're not being representative to me or the people here, so fuck you. And that's awesome. Like and that's pretty much what gets him like his big claim of fame is like him with the Stamp Act is his verbalization and his way of communicating that it's wrong and the fact that it's and the way that it is just fact, you know, like he is dismantling it from the British rule of law and it's exactly true. You know, like you can't say no to that. And that's why everybody is like, yeah, no, he's right, you know? And that's why he gets to be like one of the delegates in the first and second constitutional conventions, you know?
Yeah, and you lead me on to this fantastic quotation of his. It's a bit long, so please bear with me. But
Yeah.
I had to take this down because it was fantastic. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. And then he goes on to say, it is more important that innocence be protected than it is that guilt be punished. For guilt and crimes are so frequent in this world that they cannot all be punished. But if innocence itself is brought to the bar and condemned, perhaps to die, then the citizen will say, whether I do good or whether I do evil is immaterial, for innocence itself is no protection. Um, and just to conclude that, he says, and if such an idea as that were to take hold in the mind of the citizen, then that would be the end of security whatsoever. I
God,
mean,
what a good mind.
the guy just knew what he was talking about. And to be honest, you could probably take these sentences and throw them into any kind of trial right now, and people would say, "Oh, you know,
Yeah.
that's
Damn.
something. That's
That
something."
yeah. I'm not even 100% sure what you said, but yeah, 100 like yeah. Like I think it's
Mm.
like I also wrote that quote down just because it was just like I wrote it. I think I ended up writing it down in reference to the Boston Massacre because he ended up defending, like, I mean, when the Boston Massacre happened, nobody really wanted to be the defendant for the British in this situation. Like, they had just killed 5 people in the street. And mind you, after they had been heckled, like, I think that that's always like a point that should be brought up that I don't remember learning about when I was like learning about the Boston Massacre, was that the British soldiers were being heckled pretty harshly, and like that the colonists were like throwing stones and shit at them. And it's just like, yeah, it's a tough situation to be in. I wouldn't immediately start shooting, but I would also like, I would be on edge. And so Adams ends up, like, he's in their trial for them, and he's their representative for the trial, and he ends up getting 6 of them acquitted, and only 2 of them end up going to jail. And that's just impressive, man. Like, the dudes that you're going to fight, and the dudes that you're like delegating all of this shit with, like, you're in a few years you're going to be going across seas and you're going to be figuring out how to make peace, like, of course you're the dude to do this. Like, you're the dude who just fucking got 6 of the British that murdered 5 people acquitted in a situation that does not seem very likely. Like, I feel like if this happened anywhere else, no, like, this would be a very different situation. Like, those British soldiers would probably be murdered and or hung or something along those lines. And Adams, being the intellectual mind that he is, just is like, just fucking with the book, man. And he's just like, nope. And it's impressive. Like, it's impossible to deny how impressive that is. And even if you don't agree with what he did, like, his brain, like what he was able to do and the way that he was able to do it is just like, good job. Like, I think that it's way more um, worth talking about than George Washington's ability to like communicate in this way. Like, George Washington did write a lot of letters and whatnot, and he was well spoken, but this is a dude who knows what he's talking about. It's not that he's well spoken, it's that he knows every little thing that he's talking about. He knows that, like, the back of his hand, man. And he's able to put it all out there, and he's able, like, he knows every in and out of every argument, and it's just fucking amazing. Like, and that's why he's able to do what he does, and that's why he, like, his legacy before presidency is notable. Like, if you just don't look at his presidency, this dude's legacy is pretty pretty great. Like, I mean, especially for somebody who didn't own slaves during the time. I thought that that was really interesting. I mean, he did hire from like like enslaved people to help, like people who owned enslaved individuals. He hired their work with, like, during the his time in the VP and the presidency. But beforehand and afterward, it was all like contractual work from free African Americans and anybody else who was willing to work, and they paid them. And I thought that that was just really interesting. I didn't know that. I always thought that all of our founders had slaves. Nope, this dude was a little bit different. I just thought that that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, and his son too, by all
Yeah,
accounts. So interestingly, the only 2 presidents who, at a time when slavery was legal in the U.S., were the only 2 presidents who never owned slaves themselves.
yeah,
So yeah, very interesting indeed. And I mean, this all does come back kind of to the fact that he had a very firm grounding in the principles of a fledgling movement, idea, concept for freedom, for liberty in the United States. And whether or not it was his actual opinion that Africans would also benefit from, this growing freedom and liberty,
yeah,
he enacted that in his own personal decision making and for the family. Whether or not he was a really nice guy, that's a different matter, because there are
yeah,
also lots of criticisms that I found about him. But we can come to those again a bit later, because we really do kind of have to build up the person he was before he became president, because as we know, our grading system is kind of limited to him as a president.
yeah.
So I'd kind of want to build him up a bit before we shoot the guy down.
Yeah, no
Um,
kidding. That's why I'm like trying to like stretch out a little bit. Like, I want to stretch out his beginning bits as much as possible, just because it is like And especially for our like one-term president, his presidency isn't long and it's not full of a lot, but the things that it does have in it is not good. And so I definitely think like stretching out more of his earlier life and more of the time that he spent like in the colonies, spending time in France, and being a minister in Britain, and then coming back to America and becoming VP. Like there are all notable things happening in this time period that really are building up to his character and why he is being appointed to the positions that he gets to be in, you know?
Yeah. And we also have to consider the changes that went through him. So even after the Stamp Act, 1765, up until around 1772, he's still very much adamant that the United States should remain part of the United Kingdom of Britain, of Great Britain at the time.
Yeah.
Even though the British government, the actions taken by the British government, and the Crown, as it were in many ways misguided and wrong. However, when the Crown assumed payment of the salaries of Governor Thomas Hutchinson and his judges, instead of the Massachusetts legislature, this is when Adams kind of goes apeshit and says, no, 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 no. You guys are now destroying judicial independence, and by sort of taking over the colonial government, it is becoming much closer to the subjugation of the crown, or to the crown.
Yeah.
And so he is really pissed off about this.
It's interesting to see once again, we'll see his back and forthing, but with the British in particular, like he's very fond of the British government and the form of British government, but it's interesting to see like when he's like, oh, you've crossed the line of too much British. Like, I just think it's so interesting to see that happen with him because later on he is super in favor of the British. Like for a lot of the time, like after even as soon as the War of Independence is won, he is very much in favor of getting America back in touch with the British, like to get trade going back and forth. But to see where he's like, nope, that's wrong. I don't like that. That's not America enough, but that's also too British. Like you're too back and forth for me, man. Like it's one or the other. You're either going to stick to the America thing the whole time or you're going to be British, like an Anglophile the whole time, And it's tough to see this back and forth thing because it does lead to like these feelings of inconsistency, like especially for somebody who is going to want a government that is very close to the British form of government, This does lead to him finally making the change in mind of, hey, we need an independent like the colonies need to be an independent thing, And that's a good, like that's a big shift to see and to have, and it's a little bit more in line with where a lot more of the colonists are at, because at this point more like there are way more colonists who are more like, we're done with this, like we've been done with this for a little while. And like to finally see somebody like Adams, who's this intellectual mind of, like that feels leagues above everybody else, to see him finally like kind of be like, yes, okay. I bet that there was like a feeling of like reassurance that people felt of like, okay, so I'm not crazy, like this is wrong. That's what's happening, I think what an interesting feeling that must have been.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also interesting that what kind of really, got him so vexed was that he refused to accept that the colonies were under the sovereignty of Parliament, and he maintained that the original charter and their allegiance was exclusive to the king. So now he was happy to kind of take orders from the monarch, but he didn't want these representatives of the British public saying what the people in the colonies should be doing.
Yeah.
And this almost makes me feel as though later on, when he's president, some of the stuff that he comes out with um, kind of flies back towards this extremely interesting concept that he has of the monarch, the role of the monarch, the importance of the monarch, and whether or not for him this essence of divine rule really had some kind of fundamental basis to it.
Yeah.
And I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. I uh I think it's kind of cool to see this time period because this is where the mind shift starts to happen with a lot of people with like the divine rule of a king. Like why is it a divine rule? Like why are you the guy who gets to be in charge? You're not doing stuff for me. Like I mean with the French Revolution happening like not too like long after this, I mean the whole time those people are like you're not doing this shit for me and this is in our country, you know, like this is happening right here. And with the America thing, with it being overseas, it feels like it's easier to make that kind of disconnect with the monarch, you know, like the monarch is all the way over there and we're all the way over here, so there's immediately that disconnect. But like it's so fun to see that mind shift of like why are you in power, like what gives you the right to be here, you know? And to see Adams kind of struggle with it and think about it too, and kind of be like, is this what we think it is? You know, like, is this something that we should still have? Is this something? Because I mean, like, when he becomes VP, he spends like a month with the Senate deciding the name for the president, and like a lot of the choices end up with like Your Majesty the president and stuff like that. And it's like he very much still feels this relation to Britain and to like that divine rule, and he still feels as though like maybe it should be applicable to the US in some way. And it's interesting to see how he kind of goes, it kind of struggles with that, you know.
Yeah. And this leads on thereafter to this extremely famous event, the Boston Tea Party, for
I've never
which
heard of that.
no, I don't know what happened there. But he's obviously involved here as well, and so therefore we have to, draw into the conversation, the
Yeah.
role that this guy played in so many of these important, sort of fundamental founding events for what became the USA.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if he's really credited with, okay, he's one of the founding fathers and so on. But I'm not sure if he's really credited with so much of what actually happened. I could perhaps even go so far as to say, had it not been for him, there might not even have been the United States of America
I
or even the founding fathers.
I think that I would happen to agree with you because I think that that's not too far off. Like especially in the positions that he had been in, like right place, right time, every time. You know, like he's at these big moments, he's at these big events, and like regardless of his stature as an individual, like and his personality being such like a like kind of an abrasive person. Like he was known as being very pompous and kind of full of himself at times. Um, and so to kind of like imagine that and him being in all these situations, like if it wasn't for him doing some of these bigger decisions, like I mean, he was a dude who appointed George Washington to lead the Continental Army. Like if it wasn't for his appointment as the leader, I don't know how things would have gone, you know? I mean, I imagine that somebody else probably would have pointed out Washington. But you know what I mean? Like his involvement with like the Declaration of Independence, like his involvement with the editing and writing of that, like there's a lot behind him that really is just like he's a big guy that did a lot of really big stuff. And I agree that he's not like credited for a lot of it. Like he doesn't get note for a lot of the stuff that he's involved in.
Yeah, and also just to reiterate, with regards to the Boston Tea Party, now the ship there, the schooner Dartmouth, was owned by the British East India Company. Now, having read a bit of what the British East India Company did over in India and Afghanistan and what became Pakistan and that kind of area, these guys are absolute bastards. They are horrific, inhumane, barbaric. Name anything you want. As in, these guys
Yeah.
killed people in the kind of ways that even on Game of Thrones you're not likely to see. As in, they were horrific, the stuff that these guys did. So any
God,
kind
what
of loss.
horrible.
Oh man, I said any kind of loss that these guys received, for me, it should be applauded. Yeah, Adams also called it the destruction of the tea. He called it the grandest event in the history of the colonial protest movement, and he also called it absolutely and indispensably a necessary action. So I think I agree.
Yeah. Good on you, man. Like, just fucking taking down the system, you know? And somebody's got to do it. And he's seizing the opportunity and, like, just right place, right time. And to be able to have that intellectual mind and to also be able to speak about it so eloquently and to do what he's doing the whole time, I'm just like, good job. Like, especially just his early career is just impressive. Like, it just stacks on top of itself, and it's just like, wow, you're really setting up for something.
Absolutely. And before we get to the him becoming president, so two more sort of minor points. And I mean, we're probably not going to talk very long about his presidency, but anyway,
Yeah.
because whatever it was. But so 2 points then. During Congress, he sat on 90 committees and he
Damn.
chaired 25.
My
Yeah.
God.
Yeah. And Benjamin Rush said that he was acknowledged to be the first man in the House. Yeah. And also in 76, he became head of the Board of War and Ordnance, and he was in charge of all of the record keeping and so on. And they
Yeah.
referred to him as a one-man war department, basically because of the way in which he managed all of these things. I mean, that's just
My
crazy.
God. Just what the fuck, dude? I can't imagine doing half of what this dude is up to. Oh my god. And like in the time period that he's doing it too, like you can imagine that this shit, like it's not on like a file or like on a drive or something like that, you know? Like
Yeah, there's no email, there's no WhatsApp,
yeah, like this dude is like passing letters and writing them by hand, and he's like he's doing all of this shit and he's coordinating all of it with like people who are also writing out and delivering these letters. And like to imagine how many people he must have had to, like, even though he's doing most of this shit on his own, to imagine the team behind that to make all of it still work is unbelievable. Like, holy cow. Like, I remember reading into like his home life and like, just because he was somebody who moved around so much, like, and his family followed with him, you know, and so like his family had a lot of people, like hired servants that did a lot of stuff, and so I can't imagine how much money you're spending on people that are helping you during this time. I can't imagine how many people you're like moving during this time. Like you're not just moving your family and your 4 children. I think it's 4 children. I can't remember, but like you're also moving like I genuinely don't even know how many people it was. Like a lot probably. Like because and we're just looking at his earlier achievements, and this is a lot of shit that he's doing, you know? Like, there's no way that John Adams is riding his horse to all of these places to deliver all these letters, you know? Like, he doesn't have the fucking time to do that. He's the head of 20 committees, and he's in 90 of them, you know? Like, he doesn't have time for that shit, dog. He's gotta go, but he can't go that far, you know? And it's just so fucking cool to imagine how much work this dude had to put in to get to where he got, and then to just see like the ball like him fumble.
Yeah, and another thing, and the last point to make before we jump into his presidency. So basically, in sort of 1797, when they were preparing themselves for the election and so on,
Yeah,
he Adams himself said that he would stay out of the process of electioneering because he called it a silly and wicked game. Yeah.
truth.
Um, I mean, for me, that guy deserves, credit for that particular observation because, you and I think that we both agree with the fact that currently in the United States, it's not realistic for any bod off the street to become president. You just can't do
Yeah,
it because you
no,
need to have either millions or billions or access to people who have millions or billions. And the average bod off the street doesn't have that.
nope.
So for me, it's not really a democracy, because it's kind of hard for anyone to rise to that level. And in the early
It's tough.
days, yeah, but in the early days, one of the founding fathers, which everybody in the US say, oh, the founding fathers, he said electioneering was a pile of shit. And yet that is the process upon which now elections are conducted. Why
Yeah,
doesn't anybody remember this? Yeah.
yeah.
Number two said it. It's a silly and wicked game. Pay attention, please.
Some people like. I mean, it's amazing the small things that our founders picked up on that they were like, these are going to destroy us. Like Adams with the electioneering. Like, yeah, this is a huge problem in the U.S. right now that they're just the cap limit to get into being able to run for office is just so high that the average Joe just isn't gonna fucking make that. Like a level of money that you would never be able to conceive in your lifetime, kind of thing. And that's tough. And that really dampens the feeling of there being a democracy. And like George Washington also said that if we had a two-party system, that the United States would fall apart. And here we are with two parties. And I mean, we do have a third, but it doesn't have enough representation that most people don't think about it. Like, and so we really are in a place of just two parties, and it's so divisive. We are so, you're on that side, I'm on this side, and that's horrible. Like, we've been in places like this before, and the further that we go in these situations, like, it's not going to go well. We need to find more unifiers. And so, like, to see these little things that our founders picked up on, that they were just like, oh yeah, no, that's a thing that's gonna be a problem. Like, you fucking nailed it on the head, dog. If you came back into this time period, like 250 years later, like, you're gonna fucking be disappointed, like, at a lot of the shit that you're gonna see.
And also by just simply by the quality of individuals or the lack of
Mm-hmm.
quality of the individuals who are supposedly representing the good people of the nation. Um, okay, all right. So we've kind of built this guy up now to be, or to having been, extremely intelligent, organized in his mind, knows what he's talking about, is a revolutionary and has a very sort of clear view on what he believes should be methods for managing certain things. He's very efficient,
Yeah,
hardworking. Um, but a couple of character flaws, as you said before, he's a bit moody. He doesn't like taking advice. Yeah. So these come to be certain elements of his presidency, which create, as you suggested as well, problems within his Federalist Party. So there is a
yeah.
split, and perhaps partially it's this character of his that in some ways brings that particular split about.
It's just so interesting to see somebody who's doing so well go so low. You know, like, it's tough, man. Like, like the setup for for somebody who's doing so many great things to come down to, like, you pretty much fucked it, bud. You could definitely have a better presidency. It's tough following the first, like, and I think that the pressure's really on at that point. But like you said, like, you're not taking advice from your fucking cabinet, dude. That's the whole point of the cabinet. Like, these are all people who are experts in their field that know what they're talking about, and they're there for you to talk to and to get help from and to bounce ideas off of and to get advice. Like, these are people in your cabinet, dog. They should be as close to you as your fucking family at this point. Like, if you're president, they need to be right there. And he's not utilizing that resource. And it's such a valuable resource to use. And he's just not going to use it for most of his presidency.
Yeah, and what's even more interesting about that is the point that you make. It's particularly pertinent because at this point in the United States history, there is no real precedent for all of the principles and decisions and protocols and methodologies. You can, even though it's like the third term, so two of George Washington and the first of Adams, you can still
Yeah.
pretty much make shit up as you go on, as long as you've got a decent argument to hatch. So he could really have created so much during his presidency, considering the mass of intelligence that this person must have naturally possessed. And yet
Yeah.
he didn't do so. Probably because of I don't know, maybe becoming president was this huge ambition that he'd secretly harbored, and eventually it's there, and that's it. This is, I am God. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. However, he had one consistent thorn in his side, and that's the French, basically, throughout his presidency. And it kind of starts with the French and it ends with the French, and somewhere in between, the Brits get involved as well. But
Well,
yeah.
it doesn't help that Thomas Jefferson is his VP and is so in love with France. Like, this really does create that it creates tension in the the whole system. It creates tension in the party. And so, like, with the president making these decisions and having such, like, backlash from somebody who really is like, no, don't do that. Like, during this time, like in the very beginning of his presidency, Jay's Treaty has been enacted, and this is allowing for the American ships and British ships to trade between one another again. And so American ships are on the coast of, like, Britain, and they're traveling back and forth. Yeah, the French
Yeah.
don't like it. They are
Yeah.
very unhappy about it, and so they start sinking American ships, and it becomes this huge problem for Adams the whole
Adams.
time. Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself because a little bit later on, Jefferson and Madison come up with, like, just such a wild, like, little, like, um piece of law that ends up leading to South Carolina seceding from the Union in the Civil War, which I was like, oh wow, I did not know that. That's pretty wild. um, but yeah, just what a pain for him. Like, and to figure out how to navigate those situations, like, it's tough when you have somebody who's next to you that's the whole time just being like, no, but we like the French though. Like, I like the French. We should also like the French. Like, they helped us out.
Yeah, and this sort of divided loyalties from number two, his cabinet, as you say, it really didn't help out. So there are three main sort of affairs that I've noted during his presidency. The first one is the XYZ affair, which relates to the three individuals that the French represented for the American Diplomatic Commission, because they wanted to. Well, some people wanted to go to war with France, and Adams kind of wanted to perhaps as well, but then he decided, no, let's send a diplomatic mission to France, and see what we can sort out, to try to get them to stop sinking our ships. And exactly
Yeah.
as you say, he was undermined by Jefferson, because Jefferson basically told his contacts to communicate to Paris, look, if you kind of procrastinate and delay this process as much as possible, the longer it takes, the more it's going to suit you. And that's kind of basically what happens, is that the Americans turn up, and the French kind of leave them there for a few days, don't even speak to them.
Yep.
And then when they do, they say to them, yeah, you need to pay us a bribe. So basically, you need to give Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, a certain amount because of the insulting speech that Adams gave in Congress. And you have to pay the French Republic a certain amount of money because of the insult. And yeah, that's not really the way to conduct peace
No.
negotiations, is it?
No. Peace negotiations are like in a weird, like, when it's like, we want peace, you have to pay us money, peace kind of thing. Like, that shit is always wild. Like, I mean, what after World War One, with like us forcing Germany to pay us, like, pay back all the money for destroying like France and Britain, like, or France and like all the other countries around that area, because it was a pretty big conflict. But like, I mean, to pay all that money back, it was such a huge deal that it's just like, dude, this doesn't feel like peace, because now we're at war at home. Like, now nobody has money. And that's such a crazy idea to like, but like the idea of like coming in and being like, all right, we're going to make them wait for a few days. And then when we do the negotiations, we're going to be pieces of shit. It's just like, tight, dude. That's how
Yeah.
peace goes.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there are many things that we have to remember, that this isn't the France of today. This isn't the United States of today. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think back in those times there were 13 states, I believe was the number. Adams' government, the ruling party was called the Federalist Party. He was the
Yep.
only Federalist president. No other president represented that party, because it was divided at the time and then it split eventually. And so therefore there, very much we are looking at the formulation of political parties, the Republican Party at the time.
Yeah.
Um, you know, People don't really know what party that they want to follow or why they want to follow these parties. So, the ability of politicians to argue one way or another is pretty influential in creating this partisanship within the electorate. And it seems as though the Federalists completely screwed that up.
Yeah.
And I mean, the XYZ affair was a great opportunity for the Federalists to say, look, the French are Republicans, or they want to become a republic, and look what they're doing to us. This isn't necessarily the way we want to go.
Yeah.
But they couldn't. He wasn't able to do that. And the Republican Party in the US basically became the ruling party because they were able to take
Yeah.
advantage of the situation, and they were able to kind of dominate the narrative.
They ended up having like a 40-year long like stretch of time that they were in power, like post Adams. It was Jefferson to like, and then the next several presidents were all on that same side. And
Basically, until 1829, they all
yeah,
had the word Republican, 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 National Republican, and it's only Andrew Jackson in 1829 who comes in as a Democrat. So yeah, basically.
yeah, like that momentary like, here we come, and then like, yeah. But it's just tough to like have those long periods of time where it's just one party that's ruling, and because of that, you see the impact of what happens like in that like span of time. The US starts expanding pretty fucking hard. Like, and
Manifest Destiny.
not, yeah, manifest destiny, and it's not a friendly thing, like,
Absolutely not.
and we see it we're going to be seeing this for the next several years, how presidents are treating the Native Americans and how they're dealing with the Native Americans. And like, honestly, that's something that I didn't dig into, but I wish that I dug into more with with Adams was his dealings with Native Americans, because that's such a crucial thing when looking at the president in this time period, is like, how did they treat the people who were here first? And like, because we're going to be seeing people who are not going to fucking treat them well at all. Like, we're going to be seeing some of the meanest shit possible to people who just lived, you know? Like, they didn't do anything wrong other than get in the way of Americans. And as you know, and as you can tell, being in the way of America is not a good place to be, because America just fucking plows. Like, we just go to town and we will get there if we want to. And it's fucking terrifying. Like, we do it.
Yeah, there is this very strange. I mean, we'll talk about it much later on when we start getting to Reagan and CPAC and so on. Yeah, because there are some sort of consistent themes that lead all the way through.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting for us now to come in right at the beginning, because we can sort of reanalyze all of this stuff and we can see exactly why we've got this very sort of finance-oriented imperialism, or
Yeah.
capitalist imperialism, and the interests of not. It's not even the American state; it's the interests of individual elements within that state,
Yeah.
and the government basically pursues their interests on their behalf. But anyway, again, I'm getting ahead of
Yeah.
myself. You know, we'll be talking about this stuff next year. But
Yeah, no
yeah, so
kidding.
yeah, so the next issue then is the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, we
Oh
don't have to
yeah.
go into too much detail about this, but I mean, if you were going to kind of sort of sum
No.
these things up, how would you do it?
Yeah. So in the Alien Sedition Act, it's just like a bunch of weird shit piled in to one thing. Um, it had the Naturalization Act inside of it, which basically made it so that way you had to be a resident of the U.S. for 14 years to become like a U.S. citizen, which is kind of a long time. Um, in case you haven't noticed, and in that time period, that is a very long time. Um, so that's kind of a tough deal. That increased it pretty dramatically, if I'm not mistaken, from what it used to be. I can't remember what the original number was. But then the Alien Friends Act and Alien Enemies Act allowed for the president to deport anyone from any nation considered dangerous to the country, which is whoa. I was like, what a fucking wild thing to be able to do. And then the Sedition Act, which is easily the biggest thing that was in this, which if you said anything bad about the government, fuck you, you go to jail or you get a big fine. That included like any like false or scandalous statements that about the government, like anything that just kind of made the government look bad, um, was deemed as something that like you could be punished for. There were people who were punished for it. There was some dude who just said that John Adams had a fat ass and he was arrested for it. Just like saying it in the middle of a bar. And it's just like, what the fuck, dude? Like, and so people really were pissed off about that. Like, that ended up with like several rebellions that were put down, that of people that were like, yo, you're impeding on our First Amendment right of freedom of speech. You know, like the thing that we just established is being impeded on by number two. And like his response is, like we saw with George Washington, is to get like a military force to go put it down. And so he gets Alexander Hamilton to go put it down with like a small army, you know? And it's just like, Jesus Christ, John. What the
Yeah.
fuck?
And this is probably where what you were saying earlier, that when Jefferson, writing for Kentucky, stated that any state had the natural right to nullify any acts that they deemed to be unconstitutional.
Yeah,
So later on, perhaps we'll come back to the beginnings of some of these
yeah,
issues. But as I kind of referred to earlier, there's this sense of the importance of a king. And it seemed to me that with these, all of these four acts or whatever, they came about within a period of 2 weeks. He was almost making himself a king.
Yeah.
that he could say and do pretty much what he wanted. And if anybody disagreed, they were out. And because
Yeah.
he gave himself the right to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it doesn't really surprise me that yeah, he couldn't really
No.
carry that particular can very long.
Yeah. And I mean, like, it's just such a backwards idea for somebody who is so, like, involved in the fundamentals of the building of this country, you know? Like, he was involved in all of it. And to then be like, no, you can't say anything bad about the government or me, like, what a backwards thing to do, you know? Like, that just completely contradicts so much that you had worked for as an individual. Like, it's not like you didn't have any, like, skin in the game, you know? Like, you had worked for this for years, like decades. And then you, as an individual, as a president, aren't choosing to be like, all right, nope. And that's such a wild idea to me.
Yeah. And it kind of flies in the face of some of the arguments that he used earlier when we were
Yeah,
talking about the Stamp Act, which was basically the rights of freedom,
yeah,
essentially, and and the right to trial by one's peers. This really flew in the face of those particular principles. So it's interesting how sometimes what made a person particularly important with regards to the development of legal principles and political ethics later on are so quickly forgotten when
yeah.
they are the ones in power and are no longer the ones on the side of the rebels, which is interesting.
I don't think that there's a lot in Adam's presidency that really makes him stand out as doing much that's good. And that's tough. Like, it really puts a dampen on so much of what made him a great individual in the beginning, you know? Like, if he would have just retired after being VP and not really getting any satisfaction out of it, like, the whole time that he was in these positions, he was making his son into the most, like, political, like, somebody, a video that I watched, somebody described it as, like, him being RoboCop, but of like him being the RoboCop of the political world, you know?
Was
Like,
that your little brother?
yeah, that's my little brother.
Hey,
Just coming
does he
home
have
from
any
school.
opinions to give on this?
I honestly don't think he does. He's probably got something to say about Minecraft or Pokemon. If
Fair
we
enough.
want to change it up, you know. um,
Yeah.
but
Go on.
it's such a wild thing, you know. Like, he worked so hard for all this shit, and then to just completely contradict all of it in his presidency is just so difficult to watch, and it's so difficult to see. Um, I mean, he really did just work so hard during his entire, like, beginning of his career, but, like, I feel as though he could have stepped back and just been okay with it because he was making his son into, like, he was making his son into the most political human being that he possibly could. Like, him and his mother were trying to do that, like, and he was going to do it. Like, he does do it. He becomes president later on, like, and it's because his fucking parents are just like, you have to do this kind of thing, and it's just so fucking cool. Like, I mean, it's not super cool, but, like, it's just so interesting to see this dude who is, you see that he's on the downward, and to see him, like, at this point in his presidency, he is kind of grasping at straws, and even in the sense of just like, my legacy will live on with my child, you know, like, I will make my child this thing, and he does, and it's just
Mm.
like so much of what Adam set out to do, he ended up doing, and I think that that's just kind of impressive, regardless of, like, how good it was, you know, like, not all of it's good stuff, but so much of what he set out to do, he fucking did, and that's kind of just impressive. Like, a lot of people say that they're going to do stuff and they never do, and I'm that people. And, like, I get it, but, like, this is somebody who really does just, like, he sets his mind to one thing and he's going to do it, and he just does it. Like, he doesn't think about anything else until it's done, and he doesn't really take into account anybody else's opinions or feelings about it either. Like, I think the only person that he ever really took any like input from was his wife, through most of his presidency and through most of his life. Like, I remember reading a quote that was like that Abigail Adams had said to keep the women in mind when they were writing the Constitution or writing the Declaration of Independence, and it was like, thanks, man. Like, not he didn't do it so much, but like, appreciate that you kind of listened. But like, I mean, it kind of also goes back to with when they did write the Declaration of Independence with Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and the other two that whose names get forgotten in history, unfortunately. That there was like the original draft of the Declaration of Independence had condemned slavery, and then when it was handed off in editing to Adams and Franklin and Jefferson, that bit was removed. And I don't know who did it. We don't know who did it, but it's something to think about. Like, it got me to think, like, was Adams the dude to do it? I don't think he was, simply because of his, like, how openly he was against slavery. Like, because it was something that he did stand against pretty openly through most of his life, like especially with never owning slaves. He did tolerate the people around him having slaves, which is not chill, but like at least he's not owning slaves. And I feel as though, especially in a time period where so many of these people did, like, that's interesting, man. That's interesting.
Absolutely. And we have to take all of these little pieces of evidence and use them to build up our estimation of these individuals.
Yeah.
That in itself is quite an undertaking, but one that we're very happy to do.
Yeah.
So the final sort of, of the three elements of his presidency, which kind of defined him, we're not going to go into any particular detail of it. It's the Quasi War.
Yeah.
So with this, he kind of does he builds up the Navy, and that's what makes him known as the father of the U.S. Navy, I believe.
Yeah.
And he also, most notably, sort of oversees the creation of something called the USS Constitution, unless
Yeah.
I'm mistaken.
Yeah. Uh, pretty famous ship.
Yeah. So maybe we could talk about that again at a future point. But so one-term president, his party is falling apart at the seams. He would like to be re-elected, but isn't. His VP comes in, having formulated in many ways a different party, and he sort of escapes in the middle of the
Yeah.
night, as we alluded to earlier. Later on,
Yeah.
he does sort of rebuild his relationship with Jefferson, and they
Which
became friends again.
which
Yeah,
I thought was actually kind of cool. Like, I really enjoyed that. Like, actually, Adam's last words are, "Jefferson is still alive." Um, and by that point, like, they both died on the same day, which is 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, which is really cool. Um, and he to build that relationship, like, Thomas Jefferson had died a few hours beforehand, but like that those are his last words is just such an interesting thing with somebody who is his rival at this point, like somebody who has been like kind of working against him this whole time, even as his VP, and then to step in and to become president. Like, Adams worked really hard in the last like week or two of his presidency to fill the courts, like we had said earlier, that he stacks the courts and fills them with as many Federalist seats as he possibly can. Um, and this is like he's spending like the last hours of his time in presidency like writing these like letters to appoint these judges, and they're being sent out the door, and like writers are riding off at the middle of the night, and like by midnight he's just kind of like sneaking away. And I feel as though in some weird way it's kind of understandable to have that feeling, especially being the first president to live in this house, like you probably built this really weird attachment to it of like, I'm the first guy here, like that's kind of a cool thing. And to have this feeling of like, maybe he just had this feeling of like, I'm not quite done yet, but like maybe in like I'd like to redeem myself, but I just don't know how he could have done it after it just felt like he kind of wrecked it so hard that it felt irredeemable.
Yeah, and so this is why we said earlier on in the piece that had he remained or had he limited his political career to not having been made president, I would say vice president as well. But anyway, let's say at least president.
Yeah.
Then his legacy would have been considerable. As it is, people consider the highest position that he attained in his lifetime and judge him upon the basis of that. He is marked to a lesser degree as a result. So last time out, we did George Washington, and George Washington scored an extremely impressive 37.
What?
Okay, John Adams, Aidan.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I mean, I remember saying that wanting to keep the bar really high, and especially coming in as number 2, not doing really anything that is good, but only like kind of damaging what he had set up. He's definitely going to be in the 20s. Unfortunately, I'm trying to figure out where in the 20s. I don't think he's high in the 20s, unfortunately, as well. Kind of in the middle of the 20s, I'd say, like maybe 24. Just, he didn't do anything good. He only did damages to the things that he set up. And if we're only looking at it in this presidential, like in his presidential term, like, yeah, he's gonna have to be in the mid 20s just because it's nothing good. And with George Washington being 37, like I scored him pretty dang low, especially considering like how high the bar for a good president should be. He's definitely got to be in the. I think 24 felt like a good number, so I'm gonna stick with 24.
Cool. All right, 24 has been entered into our official document for that. So
do you feel okay with 24?
I love 24. 24, it's that's the place to be, I think, if your name is John Adams. Yeah, so just to sort of fill people in pretty much on what our plans are. So obviously they can tell that we're going to go through the presidents 1 to 47. Is it 47 at the moment?
It's 46 right now.
46. Okay, all right, yeah. But by the time we finish, it will be 47. Anyway,
it might be 47.
It could be 48, depending on how long it takes. But,
who knows?
Yeah, but because it seems also relevant that on our next effort, we're actually going to jump across the Atlantic and we're going to take the prime ministers as well in order. So that means we're going to start with Mr. Robert Walpole, I believe. And we're going to talk about him. And then we're also going to give him a rating too.
Tight.
Yeah, so just to be fair, so that should be quite interesting.
Man, that's exciting.
I'm looking forward to getting stuck into some British political corruption.
Well, it's just fun to jump across the pond when I'm given the opportunity. I feel like I'm so America focused all the time, and I'm trying to step outside of that box a little bit more. So it's fun to step over the pond.
Definitely going to help you out with that particular effort, we'll see how it goes. Aidan, thank you very, very much. It's always entertaining. Again, I'm sure I'm going to enjoy. I have to say, the last time I was editing the George Washington podcast, I was laughing so much. So yeah, thank you again.
And of course.
Yeah, see you next time.
Yeah, next time.